Remember the Forgotten.
Chapter 22. Again we go. They have the eye. Samuel's voice echoed out across the woods. James snapped his head back behind the trunk of the tree in an instant, swearing under his breath. He looked from side to side, appraising the forest around him as his expression became more and more tense. The woods, even under the dim light of the morning, seemed like a labyrinth of darkness, eager to accept a futile attempt at escape. With a steady hand, Sapphire slowly and silently drew her sword out of its scabbard, her body sidelined against a tree as if ready to jump out at any moment. James gave an unnoticed nod to her as he slowly unbent his knees and raised to mimic her movements, placing the ever-important pouch back on his belt. They remained this way, teeth gritted and fingers tense around the hilts of their blades as they listened out for what would happen next. They listened as the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps crunched in the stale earth, and the strengthening wind blew loudly. Not a word was uttered, not by Jade, not by Samuel, and not by James and Sapphire as they looked gravely at one another. Everything was still as their focus fell on the sounds of the terrifying woman stepping closer and closer. James's knuckles turned red as he gripped his blade tightly in anticipation. One final step. James and Sapphire leapt forward as Jade's figure stepped into their sights. The sorceress raised her palms in front of herself almost instantly as James's sword flew forward towards her, eyes unfazed as if she knew it was coming. The air in front of James seemed to ripple like water as his blade struck Jade's invisible magical barrier, sending sparks twindling into the air while the sword scraped across its length. The woman's expression was stern and intimidating, not even so much as flinching while the attacks came down upon her. As Sapphire's blade followed James's, Jade's other hand turned towards it, creating another invisible barrier. However, before the blade made contact, Sapphire suddenly pulled back and quickly disappeared behind a tree, rolling across its circumference to appear at Jade's other side in a split second. She swung her sword fast through the air again, and Jade's eyes widened as the attack managed to take her by surprise. She shifted both of her hands towards Sapphire even quicker, with a reflex that chilled James to the bone. As Sapphire's blade strongly but pointlessly struck the invisible barrier, though, James finally saw an opportunity. He didn't chance a slow and heavy strike to Jade's unshielded body. Instead, he reacted immediately, lifting his foot to hammer his boot right into Jade's left shin. The woman roared in pain and lifted her leg immediately, twirling around on her other foot to face James in a rage. Immediately, Sapphire swung at Jade's exposed side, cutting a deep gash along her torso and lower arm. Sapphire took a triumphant breath as the blood began to soak into the sorceress's cloak from the newly opened wound. Jade jumped quickly backwards, grabbing her injured arm and gritting her teeth while the wind seemed to shift around her, pulling her backwards at a high speed as if she'd been struck by a battering ram. As her feet landed haphazardly on the ground a few dozen feet away and her wildly flailing cloak began to settle, she hissed under her breath and lowered her head, growling to thin air as a slight shake began to encompass her darkening demeanour. Kill them! Sapphire and James both began to move forward cautiously, afraid to turn their backs on the sorceress, but they quickly halted as their eyes were suddenly drawn to some new movement around them. They watched as the small rocks and pebbles that sat on the forest floor began to slowly rise off of the ground, vibrating side to side in a blur like plucked bass strings. Jade began to move her hands gently, a breathy incantation being whispered into and stolen by the wind. James and Sapphire felt the ground gently rumble as progressively larger rocks began to rise out of the earth, pushing up mounds of dark soil and sending small clouds of fine dirt falling as the rocks shook off that which clung to them. James and Sapphire stepped back, sticking close together and raising their weapons defensively as they prepared for what was coming. A blue glow shimmered across the stones while they slowly began to float through the air, spinning and turning sporadically before finally beginning to come together and converge. As the various rocks and stones coalesced fully with each other, their forms seemed to meld into large, chaotic shapes. The first few of these vicious obelisks soon began to complete their transformations, taking on familiar, demonic forms with rocky arms and legs which were starting to move in fluid motions ill-fitting of such creatures. Two of them beside Jade raised their large, underdeveloped heads and began to lurch towards James and Sapphire, prompting the pair to take a few cautious steps backwards. However, as Sapphire peered behind her, she spotted two similar, almost complete creatures moving towards their flank. All of them seemed to move quicker with every step they took, their stiff legs becoming more and more fluid as their forms continued to develop. "Don't hurt them, Mother," came Samuel's voice, his fingers interlocked and held in front of him in a pleading manner. "Shut it!" James shouted, anger washing over his face as his head turned frantically from creature to creature. The situation was clearly dire, and as he turned to Sapphire, he saw her own visage little more confident than his own. He couldn't remember the last time he felt this hopeless. As the two creatures behind them stepped free from the trees, James turned around and charged forward, shouting his throat raw as he began to swing his sword through the air. The blade slashed through the neck of the first creature with a heavy rend, sweeping through its seemingly malleable composite until its entire head disconnected and fell backwards onto the ground. As it landed, it smashed into large fragments of solid stone, sliding off each other until the whole thing was nothing more than a pile of rocks. Then, the second creature quickly lurched its arm forward, reaching for James's throat with the long, sharp, claw-like shards of stone that seemed to have only just grown out of its hand. He jerked his neck to the side, narrowly dodging the lethal attack as the other creatures continually drew closer. Before it could attack James again, Sapphire lunged forward, plunging her sword deep into the creature's chest. It froze up in front of her eyes until not an inch of movement could be observed. As Sapphire tugged on her blade to pull it out, she found it stuck. Before she could even try and pull it free, another creature charged in from the side, slamming into her with all its strength and knocking her straight to the ground. James tried to jump forward to help, but he felt something sharp pierce deep into his side. He staggered backwards, reaching to clutch his now bleeding wound, but the new creature which had blindsided him did not let up. It rushed at him, swiping at him again and again with its blood-stained claws as he stumbled backwards. Sapphire wrestled with the lumbering rock on top of her, holding its wickedly sharp claws at bay mere inches from her body as she swayed side to side in an attempt to shake it off. James watched in horror as another of these creatures lumbered towards her with a sharp hand poised to strike. Seeing the danger Sapphire was in, James began to run toward her, but the creature attacking him lashed out again and forced him to pull back. He took a few steps away as it continued to swing for him, his eyes now darting between his compromised friend and his incessant foe. Gritting his teeth, James ducked underneath his attacker's arm just as it swung for him again, dashing past the monster while it turned to hiss at him. He sprinted towards Sapphire, sword in hand. He could hear the creature chasing him, bounding towards him and catching up, until he could feel its unearthly cold chilling his neck. Just before he could reach his struggling friend, James felt his arm be grabbed, gripped, pulled harshly backwards by his pursuer's icy hand. The world seemed to slow down. Face-stricken with 100 emotions, he did the only thing he could think to do. He used all of his remaining momentum to leap into the air feet first before the creature could stop him, flying forwards into the statue that held Sapphire's sword and sending the thing toppling to the ground. It broke into pieces as it hit the earth, scattering rubble and a sword across the grass. James soon followed it. His attacker's grip slipped from his arm, its claws tearing his flesh as it did, and he landed on his side with a thump and a cry of pain. Sapphire reacted immediately, reaching out and grabbing her sword from the rubble before slamming it downwards into the back of the monster grappling her. It froze up, somehow becoming even heavier. She summoned her strength and shoved the statue off of her, hearing her metal blade loudly snap as a heavy weight pressed it against the floor. Swearing to herself, she grabbed what was left of it, a hilt with half a blade with a slanted edge, and quickly scrambled away from the next of the monsters already looming over her. James rolled sideways along the ground just in time to avoid his attacker's bloody claw as it continued to pursue him and slashed at his throat once again. In panic, he turned and blindly stabbed the sword forward at it, just as the creature had leapt at him for a brutal finish. It froze up immediately as a blade pierced its body, just as before, and James immediately began to rattle his sword up and down in a desperate attempt to prevent it from getting stuck. James felt the sword finally start to give as he shimmied it harder, finally pulling it from the stone and breathing a sigh of relief as he glanced at his weapon. Before he could fully turn to face the thundering footsteps suddenly coming towards him, however, another creature barreled right into James, grabbing him by the throat and allowing the force of its charge to carry him through the air. He felt the wind pushed from his lungs as his back slammed against the bark of a tree trunk. The creature didn't let up, pinning him to the tree by his neck. His winded lungs pushed for air, but the thing's grip was too tight for him to breathe. He grasped and pulled futilely against its hold, but no avail would find him. Instead, he firmly gripped his sword and thrust it forward harshly towards the creature's skull. The blade didn't sink through this time. It simply scratched the surface, etching a line along the surface of the stone until it slid off entirely. It was then that James noticed that the creature was not moving, and its hand had turned cold and hard, like stone. All life seemed to have left the thing, the statue. His face tensed as he started to realise the danger that he was in, and he lifted his legs off the ground to begin to pound against the solid rock, hoping to knock it away. It did not move an inch, and his airway remained entirely closed. James watched Sapphire as she dispatched the other creature with her broken sword. His lips moved, trying to cry for help, but not a sound could be made. He watched her begin to look around frantically, eyeing worriedly a number of other creatures already beginning to approach, until she finally laid eyes upon him. James looked back at her desperately, and she immediately began to sprint forward towards him. Arriving swiftly, she raised the hilt of her damaged sword and struck it into the grappling statue's arm. The stone cracked, spewing small bits of rubble onto the ground. Past the statue, James's panicked and breathless eyes were drawn towards the figure of Jade, whose furious expression had just been replaced by a vindictive smile. Her cloak was stained with blood in numerous places, and her hair seemed to have become wild, falling down the sides of her head in chaotic strands. He watched as she slowly let go of her bleeding arm, failing to steady its shake, and raised both of her hands painfully forward. 2 small flares of light began to radiate from her palms, joining as one as she slid them together and began chanting something under her breath. James struggled harder against the statue holding him against the tree, desperately trying to mouth Sapphire a warning of the sorceress's incantation while she smashed her sword down onto the stone arm again and again. Eventually, she followed James's terrified gaze behind her, then seeing Jade, and the light in her hands growing even brighter as she finally began to unleash her spell.